And we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to bring you A Journey of Healing and Wholeness, a reading with Catherine Klatzker. My name is Rebecca Burke, and I am the Submissions and Acquisitions Manager here at Stillhouse Press. Stillhouse is a student and alumni-run teaching press run in conjunction with the creative writing programs at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and housed under the newly founded Watershed Lit Center for Literary Engagement and Publishing Practice. Since our inception in 2014, Stillhouse has published 11 books, earned New York Times Book Reviews, a Lambda Literary Award, and a Pushcart Prize. Catherine Klatzker's memoir, You Will Never Be Normal, marks our 12th publication. Moderating our conversation today will be Phil Goldstein. Phil is a poet, journalist, and content marketer who has been living in the Washington, D.C. area for a dozen years. His poetry has been nominated for a Best of the Net Award and has appeared in or is forthcoming in Rust and Moth, Awakened Voices, Amethyst Review, Constellations, the Indianapolis Review, the Lockraven Review, Linden Avenue Literary Journal, QWERTY Magazine, Great Lakes Review, and elsewhere. By day, he works as a senior editor for a content marketing agency, writing about government technology. He currently lives in Alexandria, Virginia, with his fiancée, Jenny, and their animals, a dog named Brenna, and 2 cats, Grady and Princess. Phil, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for that intro, Rebecca. And I am now delighted to introduce our reader, Catherine Klatzker. Catherine Klatzker is a memoirist, poet, wife, mother, grandmother, friend, mediator, and a retired pediatric ICU registered nurse of 22 years. Her work has appeared in Atticus Review, Intima, a journal of narrative medicine, Emery's Journal, Limehawk Journal, the Examined Life Journal, Tiferet Journal, and the Mental Health Anthologies. Originally from the Quad Cities of Illinois, she now lives in Southern California with her husband, delightedly nearby their children and grandchildren. You Will Never Be Normal is Catherine Klatzker's debut memoir about living with dissociative identity disorder. One afternoon during a routine meditation, strange tingling grips Catherine, followed by an explosion of voices crowding out her thoughts. Soon these voices, or parts, begin to emerge more distinctly in her mind, accompanied by persistent insomnia and bouts of mortifying incontinence. Fearing for her sanity, Klatzker turns to a meditation teacher and psychotherapist. What follows is one woman's unflinching excavation of years of repressed sexual and emotional abuse, manifested many decades later as traumatic dissociative identity disorder. The lived experience Klatzker brings to the page is not only encouraging, but astounding and remarkable, writes Nikki Lyssy in her review for the Sundress Blog. Her prose vibrates with life and control as she allows the reader to enter into the mind of an extraordinary woman trying to make sense of a world which few ever truly can. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Klatzker.
Thank you, Phil. Those are kind words. This chapter is called Don't Tell. It's about the first time that I met my therapist in session. Don't Tell, 2002. The voices in my head had my attention. My hands shook and a coin slipped into the street as I punched quarters into the 1-hour meter outside Dr. Lou's office building in Westwood and locked my old red Subaru. I wanted some resolution to my sleeplessness and the weird spells that had invaded my meditation. Can I really talk about this? I wondered if I could sugarcoat it somehow, not mention the incontinence. How could I tell Dr. Lou personal stuff when I was so much more comfortable skating on the surface of our relationship in our weekly meditation group? I took the elevator up to his 5th floor office. I flipped the switch by his name to let him know I was there, and I paced, too fidgety to sit down in his reception room. When Dr. Lou opened the door and welcomed me to enter, I stepped uncertainly into his office and decided right away it was a mistake. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to confront whatever was going on. Then I remembered I actually did need help, so I wavered and then sank into his sectional sofa. I huddled into the corner farthest from him, the place in the room closest to his door. Dr. Lou settled into his gray leather chair across from me and propped up his feet on his matching stressless ottoman. He appeared calm. His office was spacious, lacking tchotchkes. His desk was weathered cherry wood. The furniture was designed for lengthy sitting. There were almost no books. A potted ficus tree occupied the corner behind his chair. I knew I shouldn't be so afraid. He was well known to me as my meditation teacher already. I knew he was trustworthy. Every week I saw that he was the real deal, honest and kind. That he was also a psychotherapist was a bonus. What more do I need? He knew me too, that I often spaced out and was introverted in class, sharing little. I pulled my arms around myself to create an additional armor of safety. His full head of curly gray hair and his trimmed silver beard announced we were the same age, both of us with enough laugh lines to give credence to our years. This happened in meditation. That's why I thought of you, I began. His face was neutral. I was not used to that. I was used to seeing his expressive facial responses, his laughing eyes when he lectured in our meditation group. I couldn't distinguish what the voices in my head were saying because they interrupted and spoke over each other. I'm really nervous. I want to leave. I'm changing my mind, I said. I don't want to talk about this. Dr. Lou nodded toward the closed door. I was free to leave. He looked curious. He smiled. Nervous, he said, as if it were a new and strange idea to be nervous, seeing a therapist for the first time. Yeah, okay, I'll just start at the beginning and describe what happened in meditation, what continues to happen. I would have to tell him I couldn't control my own body. My voice shook when I got to the part about the peeing. I shifted uncomfortably and I tried to keep looking at him, but I had to look away. I thought about his door, that I wanted to leave, to not have him know this about me. I felt ashamed. I looked back at him to see his reaction. His face gave nothing away. His eyes were focused on me, attentive. Does the tingling energy travel up and down your spine or down to your feet and then up to your head, he asked. Or how do you experience the electricity of it physically? I breathed. The tingling is extreme, I told him. From my head to my hips, traveling up and down. The dizziness, shivering, and the backache are persistent. When I sit, I hear joints cracking in my cervical, thoracic, and lumbar spine. And when you feel what you call the squeezing of your pelvis and bladder, can you control your body in any way? Or do you feel totally helpless? I hesitated half a minute. It felt so helpless. That was the thing. I hated letting him see that vulnerability. My voice cracked. Helpless. Do you think it might be sexual? His expression was neutral. Sex? Of course he had to ask. I felt a wall go up. I had thought about it, but there wasn't any pleasure. It was all involuntary, spasmodic. First I was freezing, then I was dripping hot, shivering, and then unable to catch my breath, suffocating. The vibrations sometimes mimicked the seizure activity I knew intimately from my patients at work, and my helplessness was profound. No, of course not, I answered. There's nothing the least bit sexual. Dr. Lou sat in thought for a few moments, looking at me calmly. You said something in your email about not sleeping. Tell me about that. I don't need to sleep, I told him. Right now, I've been up for 24 hours. Yesterday, I slept an hour and 10 minutes. The day before was 1 hour only. It's all I need. I'm not tired. I feel energized. I paused. What kind of road am I going down? I think this is a long and winding road, he replied, watching me closely. It seems like you're revisiting painful, powerful emotions around buried childhood experiences. They remain in your musculature as well as your thoughts and feelings. At that moment, sitting opposite Dr. Lou, as my inner voices started up again, I did not know what they were. I did not know if they were multiple identities, whatever that meant, and I did not know what they wanted or if they would hurt me, and I did not know how to single them out by name. Some part of me knew all those things, but I did not. It was a puzzle many times over for me because of that my voices were trying to tell me something they had studiously kept hidden from me for my whole life. And it was too unbelievable for me to even hear, for me to accept the messengers as aspects of myself. I thought of my voices by the age and temperament that I felt when they spoke to me. Even though I resisted more specifics, that would make me crazy. I felt two younger voices, maybe even a third, open up and speak over the voices of older, more dismissive voices. It's dark. Someone is touching me, a man with a bristly face, whiskers, and I squirm. This is so strange, I thought. They seemed to speak from inside me, but they felt categorically separate and outside of me. I can't get out of the bathtub and the water is getting higher. All I can do is scream and yell for someone to help me, and my older sisters just keep laughing and making the water higher and pointing at me. No one will help me. It did not occur to me to mention my inner voices, that they were relevant or that Dr. Lou needed to know about them. I kept their presence to myself. He only needs to know about this meditation issue, I told myself. Dr. Lou's voice became so soft, I leaned forward to hear him. Now it all seems to be opening up, he said, keeping his eyes directly on me. I recognized their emotional tones when the younger voices relaxed and wanted to trust Dr. Lou, but an adolescent voice immediately pounced. I felt her juvenile energy, cynical and angry. What's with this calm voice, like he's talking to a child? What's he trying to do? Hypnotize me? Jesus. I felt my back against the corner of the couch, activated voices pushing away from Dr. Lou. No matter how long and hard I cry out, it seems like forever. No one ever comes to me when I need them, and finally I bite myself up and down my whole arm and onto my hand, hard, the one that's tied down until it bleeds, and it calms me. It's the only thing that helps. Dr. Lou continued, seemingly unaware of my distraction with inner voices. As you continue with the inner child who feels abandoned and neglected, your experience of opening should subside and the energy flow should change, he said. It's like you were put in a full body cast as a child, and now it's being cracked open and removed. Is this a helpful metaphor? Dr. Lou wanted to start with having me connect to my younger child self, to try to remember myself as a child. I sighed and felt my younger one's relief in my diaphragm. I make shadow puppet shows and sing Frere Jacques with my sisters. I dance around the house, down the stairs, around the kitchen, up the stairs, down the hall, through the bedrooms. I twirl and hop and slide, making up songs as I go. I am so happy when Daddy is home. I love him the most, better than anyone. Then my oppositional voices reemerged, and Dr. Lou's calm demeanor annoyed me. His confidence annoyed me, and I felt conflicted, confused. There were too many interruptions inside me. Dr. Lou told me we would work on skills to contain and hold overwhelming feelings. To strengthen your container, he said. I barely knew what he was talking about. I tried to go back in my mind and recall what he'd just said about the change in energy flow, but my mind was churning. It wouldn't hold on to any one thing for more than a fractal moment. My attention shifted back and forth, unable to find a stable center, and I didn't know when I went away from him to a safe place. Later, Dr. Lou described my empty stare, my deadness, the evidence of my mental departure. Much later, I saw that by the time he talked about holding my overwhelming feelings, I was already overwhelmed. I noticed I was picking at my fingers, pulling hangnails and digging into the flesh. I couldn't stop. I hadn't even told him that I was deeply afraid I was going crazy. The cellar is damp. I tell myself, there's nothing down here, spiders maybe. I brush something creepy from my face. I shudder. The only way out is locked, bolted by my mother. What's that smell? Rats. I hear their movements. It smells a little like the attic, but stuffier, more claustrophobic. This is hopeless. I am worthless. Nothing matters. My life is worthless. There is no way out. I am nothing. Inside, my preteen spoke up, joining my angry teenager, two boldly protective voices. Do not trust Dr. Lou, she said. You know you cannot trust anyone. Don't believe him. You will be hurt. She said this clearly. It was frightening to hear from her when she was little more than a felt sense, before I knew her better, before she revealed her mission to keep me quiet, that she would say anything to shut me up. The inner bedlam and my shifting voices brought up deep sadness, and I felt unable to articulate my needs or fears. I wanted to back away from Dr. Lou, even as I believed agreeing to be in telephone or email contact twice daily could keep me safe. I noticed I referred to myself in the plural when I thought to myself, now that we've explained ourselves, I just don't want to continue. I resisted making a long-term commitment to therapy, but I agreed to twice daily contact because Dr. Lou was monitoring my safety. I'd like to understand this better and help you as all this continues to unfold, he said. All this? All what? I felt I couldn't tell anybody anything of what was so incomprehensible that I was gagged. Don't tell. This was basic in my world. Don't tell. I wanted my voices to go away, to leave me alone. I studied Dr. Lou's unblinking eyes. Through my inner tumult, I chose him to help guide me because I trusted him. My older voices trusted no one unconditionally. My innocent little girl was on the fence, and my younger voices said yes. Dr. Lou became my therapist.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Catherine, for that wonderful reading. We're now going to go into a Q&A, and I have some questions, but we're also soliciting questions from our audience. So I think that to start the discussion, it might be good to ground the audience a little bit in this world that you're describing, in the experiences that you're describing in your book. So my question is, what is dissociative identity disorder? And another question that's kind of related to it might be, what do most people misunderstand about DID?
Well, in dissociative identity disorder, a person's sense of self is fragmented, and it's distributed among several semi-autonomous subselves. and each may have its own history and not know anything about the others. And the main self, which would be this self, may not know any of it. So it's confusing.
Yeah.
we may not be aware of any of it for a long time. I would say that this occurs always as a result of trauma, and it's usually very, very early trauma in young childhood. It might be a kind of complex PTSD or chronic trauma.
Well, on that note, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that. So, my poetry collection that I'm working on for Stillhouse focuses on kind of the multifaceted experience and response to trauma, specifically child sexual abuse. And I know that, that shame that one can feel when they have a secret or secrets, and they feel that they have to keep it inside. That's obviously a strand that runs through your book. So I'm curious, how did writing about your past and how the trauma informed, dissociative identity disorder that you were experiencing, how did writing about all that help you confront that trauma and that shame?
I had dissociated it. I mean, it's so interesting because I didn't have words for it. And so writing, of course, helped a great deal because it helped me connect to the shame, because I had been hiding or dissociating from the shame. So I think it's in that sense very different from somebody who had not been hiding or dissociating from it. I think I was keeping journals, and I think that might have been an essential thing, and I didn't know it at the time, but a lot came out of writing, because even in keeping journals, some parts were writing in the journal. I mean, I know that sounds a little crazy, but it was true, and a lot of parts were writing in the journal. I was finding a lot of emotional depth in the writing of journals, and when I was learning to not dissociate, I could name the shame, but it was a little different than just being able to write about it. I had to find it first. The writing
Sure.
was in there.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get into some of the technical kind of writerly things, but I wanted to stay there for a second with you, which is, these parts are living within you, and then you become aware of them, and it's obviously a very tumultuous experience for it all to rise up, and then for you to, then become aware of them. So I'm curious, how much time after you first started working on this, with Dr. Lou, how much distance did you need to start kind of taking a step back and writing about it as a way to understand it? Was there any kind of threshold moment when you felt comfortable, really kind of writing about it?
I needed a lot more distance than I might have expected. Denial is very strong. At first, when I was writing, I thought I could write around my parts. I thought I wouldn't have to write about them. I thought I could still try to be normal. But that wasn't working out so well. And I found that I didn't have a coherent narrative at all without writing about my parts, that my parts kind of, my story is my parts. So when I decided I could write about my parts, I was very aware that I was outing my mental illness, and that there's a great deal of stigma there, but I still needed to do it.
Wow, go ahead.
And then it was in the writing of that, it was still very difficult because it's hard to write about all these different personalities who are me. And I mean, just technically hard. And I found that technically I was writing of them as I knew them in that moment, instead of going all the way back to how I learned and what that evolution was of learning. And that was a painful process. And when I finally committed myself to that process, it took a while. It took a long while.
I can imagine. Well, it's almost like you anticipated a question that came in from the audience in your previous response. And somebody from the audience is asking if you could discuss the stigma of having a mental health issue and trying to maintain one sense of self in the face of working in a profession that should understand, but doesn't always.
Well, I think one of the remarkable things about what was happening as I was working with my parts and working with Dr. Liu was that I was able to keep functioning perfectly. I mean, I still was working. I was working quite well. And my parts didn't interfere. When I decided to tell a few people at work about dissociative disorder, that I had that, I mean, I picked the people that I told that to. I found that medical people were really quite interesting. They were quite wonderful because they were surprised, and some of their first questions were, how do you keep from being re-traumatized at work? Because I dealt with trauma at work. But then their questions were really curious medical kinds of questions. And they, I think, had as much admiration for my parts as I do, because my parts really saved me. I mean, I do have a great deal of admiration for what the brain is capable of to protect us. And that's how I see it now. And I think medical people got that quicker.
Well, that's fascinating. And I definitely identify with, the process of telling people about a trauma or about something that you had been keeping secret, and you get more comfortable telling about it the more people you tell about it, and then it becomes just something that you can talk about. So I totally get that. I did want to kind of ask you some technical questions, from a writer's perspective, and you mentioned kind of the journaling aspect of this. When you were writing the book, how hard was it to keep all the pronouns straight, and how hard was it to organize the narrative when you have all these different parts that you're writing about that are so central to your identity and to the narrative?
That was hard. Pronouns might still be hard. As a last edit for everything I write, I go through and check my pronouns because that's just a habit. I mean, it's not that I'm fragmenting now, but it's that there has been a habit of using first person plural. Although I think sometimes when, as an aside, when I think back to my childhood that I do remember, and I speak of things that I did in my family, I often refer to everything that I did as we did this and we did that, and because I think of, I'm one of 13 children, and the 4 middle girls were a group. I mean, we were a really solid group, and and we did a whole lot of stuff together. And I think of that group of four as my childhood. The childhood that I remember is being a group of four, the four girls. So there's that, and there's also the DID. So it's hard to see which is which sometimes. In addition, when I was writing this, I found it very, very difficult. And so what I did is I wrote separate sections for each part, and printed them all out separately without knowing if I would keep them, where I would fit them into the puzzle, because they were as if they were puzzle pieces, or if I would throw them out. And then I had to organize them into the whole story. I went to a writer's retreat at Ragdale in Illinois, and I took all my journals and I organized what I thought would be the big picture of how things would flow. And a long time after I got back, because it went through lots of stages, I took all of those puzzle pieces that I had written, and I hung my husband helped me, hung a clothesline diagonally across my study, because the floor isn't big enough. And with a clothespin, I hung all the different segments, and then I moved them around and organized it so that it finally made sense to tell a linear story in a non-linear way. But I had to do it so that it took up, it was visual, it was tactile, and it was auditory. I mean, I had to use all those senses.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And I even took the whole thing to the shredder in 2016, but that's another story.
Well, so someone from the audience kind of, and you've answered a little bit of this, but someone kind of had a process question for you, which was describing, asking you to describe the process of moving from the journal material to composing the book, and how long did it take you to decide that you wanted to write a memoir, and how long were you doing the journal stuff for? So kind of going from journal to memoir.
Well, I love to write, and I for a long time have been taking writing classes, have been writing poetry. I even had a few years of doing children's lit. I just love to write. And when I was a little girl, I loved to write. It wasn't the profession I was in, but I do think I'm a writer. And when I first started this book, it started as poetry, oddly enough. We had taken a trip back to our daughter's graduation, and on the way back to California, we stopped in Illinois, and purposely made a stopover so that we could visit my hometown for the first time since I was 12. And we visited all the old sites, the house I grew up in, the school I went to, and so on and so forth. And we took pictures. We also visited a few remaining relatives. And it was a good trip. And when I got home, when I was going through the pictures, poetry flowed from the memories. And I had registered already for a creative nonfiction course at the university. And the teacher asked for some writing, to see some writing. And I said, well, here's what I have, see what you think, because this just happened. And she wrote back and said, you have a story. I don't do poetry. And she said, I can refer you to somebody, a really good poetry teacher you can work with, or you can be in my class and you'll just have to, figure out how to make that transition to creative nonfiction. And I thought, maybe I'll try creative nonfiction. And so that's where the kernel of that started.
I'm fascinated by that, and I'm curious to just ask you, given the story and your background and the material, what are the advantages or disadvantages of, working through this, either, in the two different forms, in poetry versus creative nonfiction, in our memoir? What do you think has allowed you to, tell your story that you found in the form of memoir that couldn't necessarily be translated via poetry?
I think it still could have worked in poetry. But,
well, that's great. That's great. It's good to know for me.
But I found that in putting it into creative nonfiction, I had to slow down. I had to slow down so much more and put in so much more detail than I ever would have had to do in poetry. In poetry, you have to go deeply emotionally, but it's not that it's easy. It's not. But in the creative nonfiction, I had to slow down and go deeply into all kinds of other details that you never have to do in poetry. Mm-hmm. And it was new. It was new to me. And I was constantly being told, back up, slow down, tell me more about that, and tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. And we don't have enough detail.
Yeah, I mean, in poetry, you can kind of hop and skip around and, let the emotionality of the poems fill in the gaps.
Exactly.
But, you can't really do that in a memoir because people don't know the details. I'm curious to get your take on this, because I found writing my poetry to be incredibly cathartic. And I've only been in therapy for about 3 years, dealing with this, and I started writing, the poetry that became the book, about 5 or 6 months into doing therapy, and been doing that ever since. And so it's been incredibly cathartic for me. So I'm curious to know how much of writing the memoir was an act of catharsis for you, and how much of it was intentionally to illuminate, dissociative identity disorder, and connect with others who either don't know about DID or may have had similar experiences.
I think that the therapy was the healing. I think writing helped me reflect on what had happened and the sequence of the events, and how grateful I am because what I was finding as I was writing, I was discovering all these moments of grace and kindness that had happened throughout the story that I hadn't actually paid a lot of attention to before. And it was really wonderful to find them. So I think it was the reflection. The writing gave me the time to reflect on what had actually happened, because it had been huge. I mean, to me, it seemed huge. When I started writing, when I started therapy, I had no idea where it was going or what I would find out. Mm-hmm. When I started writing about what actually did happen, it was like that reflection revealed more than if I hadn't started writing. Mm-hmm. It allowed me to organize it, I think, and to really see more of the kindness and the grace and the good things that came out of it.
Well, talk about that for a little bit, because I think that, one of the, I don't know if it's a misconception, but one of the things that I think can often happen when you're writing or reading about trauma is that it's very easy to spend a lot of your focus, both as a writer and a reader, on the heavy aspects of it, because it's obviously emotionally heavy, and the pain and the loss and the grief and the anger, and especially if you're a writer who has gone through that, but has gone through a healing journey through therapy, and through whatever other means you've used to heal. I think it's often easy to lose sight of or minimize the joy and the grace and the kindness that you're talking about. I'm just really curious for your thoughts on that, because I found in writing my book that one of the things that we've done is make sure that it's very clear to the reader that it's not all of
Right.
the pain and the loss and the grief. That's there, and that's never going away, and that's necessary, but there is this joy and this kindness.
I think it's because the writing gives you the creative space. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah.
It does. It gives you the creative space to look deeply at the whole picture. I mean, I didn't ever want to emphasize the trauma. I mean, it's there. It's there. But so is the rest of it. And I think it's the art. I mean, I think it's the creative space of writing that allows you to find that and to see it. I'm just thinking out loud here.
No, I mean that it makes a lot of sense, and especially like you were talking about with memoir and kind of slowing things down. You kind of there's this it can happen in poetry, obviously, where you can spend a whole poem focusing on a single moment and kind of unpacking that single moment. But I think that what you were talking about, of having the space to reflect and having the space to slow things down, enables that to come forth, because otherwise you're just sort of rushing through from point A to point B to point C, and then when you slow things down, it allows things to be illuminated that you might not have otherwise thought of as the important aspect of a particular moment or experience.
Yeah, I wanted to make sense of it, and I noticed things like I found myself with more empathy than when I started, and I wondered, why is that? I mean, why is that? There had been a shift. I mean, I noticed that there had been a shift, probably more than one, along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the writing just allows you to take your time and look at that and find that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that. It's something that I've been trying to add and work through in my book, in terms of writing poems from not to give too much away about my book, which is more than a year away, but writing about things from other speakers' perspectives, and trying to empathize with certain characters who might not on the surface warrant a lot of sympathy or empathy from a reader who's reading about
Right.
a narrative of trauma, and people who either inflicted trauma or were indifferent, etc. But yeah, I found the more that you write, the more that empathy comes forth, both for yourself but also potentially for others.
Right.
What, you know, I think that, like we were talking about at the start, there may be misconceptions, in pop culture and the culture in general about dissociative identity disorder. What do you hope readers will take away from reading the book, either in learning about, your unique experience or about DID in general? What do you want to leave people with when they get to that last page?
Well, I guess we never did talk about the misconceptions that people have, which
Sure.
which I think a lot of times people think that's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of thing, that people tend to believe, the sensationalism of the TV programs and the movies.
Right, that it's like a light switch that you just switch on and off.
And the violence and all of that, and it's just not true. I don't think that, in those movies, they when they show the switching of the characters, it's like very dramatic, and it's really not like that. It's I think, I've asked people what did they see, if they saw anything with me, and it wasn't noticeable. I mean, what my husband might have seen would be, I might space out more than usual, or I might be more moody. I mean, that's what you hear a lot, is people might seem more moody, but it's not noticeable. So people really don't know what DID is, and the people who do, I think, have contacted me. Some of them have found my website and have contacted me and told me how grateful they are to have found it, that it's very helpful, which encourages me, because I didn't know that would happen. I mean, I didn't know anybody would find it, because I hadn't actually told anybody about it. So that was interesting. I thought, well, this is useful, because if people are looking for this, if people really need to know that we're not alone and that this is treatable, that's really important. I think what people really will come away from is that there's like 3 stories in the book, and I think one of them is about the DID that was caused by the early childhood abuse, and the integration, the dissociation and the integration. The other story would be about making sense out of it, and how I did that with my own, travels and my own relationships, and discovering my own inner strength. And the other story, which just happened, and I wasn't necessarily intending it, but it's been pointed out to me, is more of a social commentary in part of the book about the struggle of a single mother in the United States. That's very much in the book too. Yeah.
I mean, what you said about people finding it and finding it helpful and feeling like they're not alone really resonated with me, because that's something that I hope, my book can eventually accomplish. And I think it's incredible to be able to write something that, is making sense of something that happened to you, but that obviously affects, a lot of other people, each in their own unique way. But, it creates this really kindred connection that I think is important. We did have one more audience question come in, and it is, over the course of this discovery, how much do you think the childhood trauma and your response to it guided you to be the person who you are today?
Probably 100%. I would have to say. I mean, even when I was sad and upset and angry at all that I felt I was lost because of it, I have to acknowledge, here I am also because of it, and that's not a bad place. It's a good place.
I wholeheartedly agree, having kind of been there myself. So I think we're going to close it there. So thank you all for participating. Thank you for listening in, and what a wonderful reading. Thank you, Catherine, for a great conversation. And of course, Catherine Klatzker's memoir, You Will Never Be Normal, is soon available from Stillhouse Press.